My name is Tessa Morren, but most people call me Tessa. I am 60 years old, and for the past 3 decades, I have stood quietly behind the man the world calls a visionary. A man the business magazine covers praise as a self-made genius. A man I once loved with a loyalty so steady it frightened even me. I was the operations director of Morren Dynamics, though my title had been reduced to something between assistant and relic. And in the morning, everything shattered. I learned exactly what I meant to him in front of 120 employees. You are suspended until you apologize to my ex. My husband, Grant Morren, 58 years old and CEO of the company we built together, barked across the conference room. For a moment, no one breathed. Then the laughter came, uneasy at first, then louder, until the room pulsed with it. Someone covered their mouth, someone else whispered, and all I felt was heat rising up my neck, settling across my face like a burn I could not soothe. I stood there, spine straight, palms resting against the cool steel edge of the table, and instead of shouting, instead of defending myself, instead of begging for dignity the way some women do when they are blindsided, I simply said, "All right." One word, calm, quiet, a word that felt like closing a door from the inside. Grant smirked as if he had just tamed something unruly. "Finally learned your place, haven't you?" His voice carried the easy triumph of a man who believed the room belonged to him. And for so long, it had. In that slow-motion moment, the humiliation did not crush me. It clarified me. The faces around me blurred, the sound of laughter grew distant, and all I could see was the reflection of the overhead lights on the small silver USB hanging from my keychain, an old keepsake from when Grant and I were young and poor, before titles and boardrooms and secret meetings with his ex-wife. We had engraved our initials on it, a promise back then, a burden now. I closed my hand around it as I walked out. No one saw the shift inside me. No one heard the quiet preparing itself. Humiliation can destroy a person, but sometimes it awakens them. The next morning, Grant strode into the office with the swagger of a man who believed his problems stayed exactly where he left them. His voice echoed down the hallway as he greeted executives and clapped shoulders. His confidence was an armor, one built on the assumption that I would always be where he placed me. But when he reached my office door, the armor cracked. My desk was empty. Every file is gone. Every binder moved. The framed photo he hated, the one from our first apartment, where we looked young and tired and hopeful, was off the wall. The chair was pushed in neatly, the air still. The only thing left behind was the faint outline of where my laptop once sat. He pulled out his phone, about to call me, when he noticed something unusual. My employee badge, the one he wore for 20 years, was missing from the access log. Disabled, deactivated, gone. And then he saw the key hook. The silver USB, the one that never left my side, the one he once mocked as sentimental clutter, was no longer there. Before he could make sense of the silence in the room, the company's legal team burst through the door, papers in hand, faces drained, voices trembling. "Grant," the head counsel said, breathless, "what did you do?" They weren't looking at him with sympathy. They were looking at him with dread. And for the first time in all the years I had known the man, I wish I could say he showed remorse. But what washed over his face wasn't regret, it was fear. Because humiliation, when delivered loud enough, echoes. But the consequences of arrogance whisper long before they strike. I wasn't there to witness it. At that exact moment, I was sitting in a quiet cafe across town, stirring a cup of tea, watching the steam rise the way people watch smoke after a fire. My phone buzzed with message after message, but I let the screen dim untouched. Silence felt like oxygen. Silence felt like stepping into a new room inside myself. And as the city moved around me, none of them knew the truth that was about to unravel. None of them knew why the legal team had sprinted into that office. None of them knew the weight of the USB that was no longer hanging from my keys. A lifetime of being overlooked teaches you one thing: the most powerful moves are made in plain sight. quietly, patiently, without hysteria. Before we continue, if you believe in stories where women rise with dignity, where quiet strength becomes its own language, where justice comes softly but lands deeply, I invite you to like this video, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. It helps this channel reach more people who need a voice, and it supports the work behind these stories. Now, let me tell you how everything truly began. I did not walk out of that cafe because I was brave. I walked out because something inside me finally loosened, something that had been pulled too tight for too many years. And as the city noise blended into a gentle hum, memories I had kept tucked away for decades began rising like dust from an old trunk. If you want to understand why the USB mattered, why the legal team burst into that room, why Grant's voice cut so sharply when he suspended me, then you must know what came before. You must know the part of the story no one ever asks about, the years when I did not have a title, but I carried the weight of one. 3 decades earlier, I was not the silent woman in the corner of the conference room. I was the engine behind a dream that belonged to both of us. Back then, we lived in a cramped apartment with peeling wallpaper and a kitchen sink that dripped no matter how many times Grant insisted he had fixed it. We had nothing except a secondhand desk, an old computer, and an idea we believed in so fiercely it felt like oxygen. Morren Dynamics was not born in a boardroom. It was born in our living room, between stacks of cheap noodles and piles of notebooks filled with my handwriting. Grant was magnetic. He could walk into a room and charm people with nothing but a smile and a promise. But charm does not build systems. It does not negotiate contracts. It does not run payroll or structure operations or anticipate crises. Those pieces fell to me, not because Grant asked, but because someone had to hold up the other end of the dream. Someone had to steady the ladder he climbed. In those early days, I worked 20-hour stretches without complaint. I drafted proposals until my fingers cramped. I learned accounting software from scratch. I handled vendor disputes, organized pitches, and wrote the first operational blueprint that would later become the backbone of the entire company. Grant would return from meetings with investors, eyes bright with possibility, and hand me napkins scribbled with ideas. "Can you turn this into something real, Cici?" he would ask. And I always did, not because I was obligated, because I believed we were building something together. I was not his assistant. I was his counterpart. But time has a strange way of rewriting stories, or rather people do. As the company grew, so did Grant's appetite for recognition. The man who once thanked me for staying up all night now introduced me to new partners as my right hand, then my loyal assistant, and eventually my longtime secretary. Each title is smaller than the last. Each introduction erases a little more of the truth. I told myself it was harmless. I told myself the work mattered more than the credit. But there is a quiet hurt that builds when someone rewrites history while you are still alive to remember it. Toi lun yo, con ong e lun quen. I always remember, while he always forgets. That line had followed me for years like a shadow. Grant remembered the applause. I remembered the nights we slept on the office floor. Grant remembered the publicity photos. I remembered the contracts I negotiated while he was out celebrating. Grant remembered the praise. I remembered the caution, the deadlines, the spreadsheets, the legal pitfalls we avoided because I caught them in time. He remembered being the face. I remembered being the foundation. But the world only sees what it's shown. The more successful we became, the more he polished his own role. People praised him as the mastermind behind every department, every breakthrough. And instead of correcting them, he smiled. Sometimes he would rest a hand on my shoulder and say, "Tessa keeps us organized. She's been with me forever." With me, not beside me. The shift was subtle at first. A misplaced credit here, a forgotten contribution there. Then it grew. Soon my name was missing from reports I drafted. Ideas I originated were presented as his. I watched the narrative change. In real time. Grant the genius. Grant the visionary. Grant the architect of everything. And me? I became the person who brought coffee into meetings. the one who took notes, the one who sat at the edge of the table, never the center. I was not invisible. I was erased. Still, I stayed. Not because I lacked strength, but because I believed leaving would undo everything we had built. When you pour your life into a foundation, you do not abandon the structure easily, especially when you think the person standing beside you still remembers the truth. But memory is selective, and Grant's memory rarely included me. Whenever disagreements surfaced, he brushed them aside with a practiced, dismissive charm. "Tessa, why make everything so emotional? People see you as part of the furniture here. That's a good thing. Stability." Furniture, a fixture, not a partner, not even a person with contributions worth acknowledging. And yet, for years, I accepted it. I kept working, keep building, keep remembering. The USB, the small silver one I kept on my keychain, held the original operational framework I wrote in our tiny living room. Grant used to call it your magic. It was the blueprint that allowed our company to scale from a two-person dream to a multi-million-dollar enterprise. He forgot that. I never could. That USB became the emotional anchor of my life's work, a reminder that even if the world rewrote my role, the truth lived in documents and systems he could never replicate without me. So while Grant stood in that conference room weeks ago shouting in front of employees who saw me as a relic, what he didn't realize was simple. The ghost he thought I had become was the one holding the very bones of his empire. The humiliation he delivered so loudly was nothing compared to the quiet revelation that followed. And as I sat in the cafe, stirring my tea slowly, watching the world move without urgency, I finally let myself acknowledge it. I had been the foundation of his success. And somewhere along the way, I allowed myself to become his shadow. But shadows only exist when they are cast by something standing in the light. And I was ready, finally, to step out of his. The first time I saw Lydia Crane step back into Morren dynamics, I felt the shift in the air before I understood it. I was sorting through a stack of operational reports when the elevator doors opened and the atmosphere inside the office changed the way a room changes when a storm approaches. Subtle, but undeniable. Conversations dimmed. People straightened their posture. Even the hum of the overhead lights seemed to fall in line with the sudden tension. Grant led the way, smiling too widely. Behind him walked Lydia, 54 years old, elegant in a sharp navy dress that looked tailored to cut through people. The kind of woman who seemed carved from cool marble, beautiful, polished, unmistakably calculated. She carried herself the way some people carry weapons, with intention. Grant clapped his hands once, drawing everyone's attention. "Everyone," he announced, "please welcome back Lydia Crane, our new strategic advisor." Back. The word stung, though I kept my face neutral. She had been his wife long before me. Their marriage ended years before Grant and I met, but the residue of their history was something he never quite washed off. I had only heard fragments about her. Her intelligence, her ambition, her ability to dismantle someone's confidence with a single pointed sentence. I used to think those stories were exaggerations, but the way she scanned the room that morning, measured, assessing, unimpressed, made me realize the stories had been generous. When her eyes landed on me, she paused just long enough to make the moment noticeable. Then she smiled. Not kind, not cruel. A smile that said she had already evaluated me and placed me exactly where she believed I belonged, on a shelf behind her, collecting dust. Grant gestured for her to follow him to his office. "Lydia will be overseeing several strategic initiatives with me," he said loudly, almost performative. "She brings invaluable insight." I stood there, holding a folder to my chest, feeling the weight of something I couldn't yet name. Later that afternoon, I learned what that weight was. Lydia visited my department under the guise of understanding workflow. She asked questions that weren't really questions. Each one was designed to expose flaws, even in processes that had functioned flawlessly for years. She listened to explanations with the detached curiosity of someone evaluating a museum exhibit. interesting, but outdated. At one point, she examined a report I had drafted and said, "Functional? Efficient? A bit old-fashioned, but I suppose it gets the job done." Old-fashioned. The phrase hit harder than she knew. Or perhaps she knew exactly. It wasn't the words themselves. It was the tone. Light, airy, almost bored. The tone of someone flicking lint off a sleeve. Over the next weeks, subtle shifts occurred. Proposals I had prepared were rerouted through Lydia. Meetings I used to attend were reassigned. A few of my responsibilities were reassigned temporarily to others. And every time Grant noticed my confusion, he brushed it off with a chuckle. "Tessa, don't overthink it," he'd say. "Lydia's just helping streamline things." But streamlining, as it turned out, meant trimming away anything connected to me. That was also when Maribel entered my life. She was 25, newly hired, with a quiet presence that made her easy to overlook if you didn't pay attention. Her desk was beside mine, and though she rarely spoke, her eyes missed nothing. She had that bright, hungry curiosity I once had in my 20s, the belief that hard work could actually shape a future, that loyalty would be rewarded, that being good was enough. One morning, while reviewing a schedule that had been unexpectedly altered, I sighed without realizing it. Maribel glanced at me, then leaned in slightly. "Ms. Morren, is everything all right?" Her voice was gentle, careful, as though she recognized she was stepping into territory she had no right to enter, but felt compelled to anyway. "I'm fine," I said automatically, but she didn't look convinced. "I noticed your name wasn't included in the operations briefing later," she said softly. "But the notes were written in your format." There it was, subtle observation wrapped in innocence. In that moment, I saw myself at her age, noticing disparities I didn't have the courage to name. "That happens sometimes," I answered, forcing a composed smile. "Just part of the changing structure." She nodded, but her brows pinched with unease. A week later, Lydia made her first direct move. During a department review, she announced a change to our workflow that contradicted a process I had refined for over a decade. When I gently raised a concern, she didn't look at me. She looked at Grant. "Tessa is used to the old system," she said lightly. "It's understandable she'd have reservations." Then she turned to me with the same cool smile. "Don't worry, we'll help you adapt." Help me adapt. As if I were an outdated program needing an update. The worst part wasn't the condescension. It was the way Grant laughed. Soft, dismissive, almost embarrassed by me. That night, as I stayed late organizing files she had restructured, Maribel lingered by her desk. When I switched off my monitor, she spoke quietly. "She's trying to push you out," she said. Not as a question, as a truth. I studied her for a moment, her conviction, her clarity, her quiet courage. She was a reflective mirror, showing me who I had been 30 years ago and who I had allowed myself to become. "She's testing boundaries," I finally said. "She wants to see how much I'll tolerate." "And how much he'll let her," Maribel added. The honesty in her voice startled me. Young as she was, she understood dynamics people twice her age missed. It was then I realized why I felt a strange kinship with her. She could see what others ignored. She noticed the quiet dismissals, the subtle shifts, the unwritten power plays. She saw the story beneath the surface, something Grant and Lydia underestimated. And in that season, when I felt reduced, minimized, slowly pushed into the background, her presence reminded me of who I once was, of who I still could be. I didn't know it yet, but Maribel would become the single quiet witness to everything that followed, the only person who recognized the storm long before the thunder arrived. Looking back, I can see how every subtle shift led to that moment in the conference room. The weeks of Lydia's presence, the erasure, the quiet pressure, the way Grant had begun to treat my contributions as background noise. What I did not know then was how quickly everything would reach its breaking point, and that morning, it did. Grant called for an all-hands meeting, something he rarely did. There was an urgency in his voice as he asked the entire staff to gather in the main auditorium. I took my usual place near the side wall, clipboard in hand, the silver USB warm in my pocket. I remember thinking the meeting would be about a client issue or a departmental restructure prompted by Lydia. I was wrong. He stepped onto the stage with the confidence of a man who believed he owned every eye in the room. The lights hit him just right, outlining his posture in a way that made him look authoritative. He scanned the crowd and paused the moment his gaze landed on me. A small shift of his jaw told me everything. I felt the warning before he spoke. This company cannot function with disloyalty. His voice echoed across the room, especially from people who should know their place by now. A quiet ripple went through the crowd. I held still. Then he said it, loud, clear, cutting. "You are suspended until you apologize to my ex." A murmur swept through the space. Then someone laughed. Another followed, and soon 120 people were laughing. The chairs shifted, shoulders shook. Even those who did not want to laugh stayed silent rather than stop the others. I stood there motionless. My face burned, but my spine did not bend. I did not respond. I did not ask for an explanation. Grant waited for a reaction that never came. When I finally spoke, the room quieted again. All right. Not angry, not pleading. A quiet acceptance that was not submission but separation, a boundary drawn without theatrics. Grant smirked, pleased with himself. "Finally learned your place, haven't you?" It was a performance meant to remind everyone of his power. But something else shifted instead. I felt it inside me first, like a thread snapping. Then the silence deepened. The humiliation he intended did not settle the way he wanted. It turned, becoming something sharper inside me, something cleaner. I walked out, steady and silent. The laughter behind me grew faint. The click of my heels on the tile sounded louder than their voices. I did not look back. In the hallway, I heard footsteps running after me. "Miss Morren, wait." I turned to see Maribel, breathless and anxious, her badge swinging from her neck. Her expression carried a mix of outrage and worry that reminded me painfully of myself at her age. "Miss Morren, you didn't do anything wrong." Her voice trembled. "Everyone knows that. He should never have spoken to you like that." I watched her for a moment, this young woman standing in the hallway with courage she didn't realize she possessed. She looked at me as if I were someone worth defending. That alone softened something in my chest. Without speaking, I placed my hand on the silver USB at the edge of my keychain. The metal felt cool, grounding, a reminder of the years behind me, the years he had forgotten. "Go back to work, dear," I said gently. "You have a bright future here. Let today stay with me." She looked conflicted, as if she wanted to protest, but she nodded slowly. I could see the understanding in her eyes. She knew my silence was not weakness. It was preparation. As she walked away, a group of employees near the break room whispered. Their words carried just enough for me to hear. She should have retired years ago. She's too old for this pace. Grant's finally doing what needed to be done. Each comment slid into me like a paper cut. Small, sharp, almost invisible, yet painful. These were people I had trained, defended, guided. People whose work I had shaped. People who used systems I designed, policies I wrote, processes I built. They did not know the truth behind those systems. They never questioned where the structure came from. They only knew what Grant told them. To them, I was just a fixture in the background, something that had aged out of relevance, something ready to be replaced. But as the whispers faded, something else rose inside me. Strength. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind that sits beneath the skin like a steady pulse. I realized their words did not define me. They exposed the emptiness of the room I had outgrown. I walked to my office one last time. My hands moved with a calm I did not force. I gathered the items that belonged to me. The framed photo, the notebooks with my handwriting, the operational binder with my initials on the corner, and then the USB. I slid it from my keychain and held it in my palm. I took one last look around the room and felt a strange, unexpected relief. The kind that arrives when a door finally opens after years of waiting. When I left the building, I did not feel suspended. I felt released. The world outside was bright. The sky stretched wide. And for the first time in a long time, My steps felt like my own. When I walked out of Morren Dynamics that day, I didn't go home. I didn't wander the city or sit on a park bench the way people often imagine someone does after a public humiliation. My steps turned instinctively toward a place almost no one knew existed. Certainly not Grant, and absolutely not Lydia. A place I had built quietly, meticulously, with the same patience I had once poured into his company. TM Consulting, my office, my sanctuary, my contingency plan. I founded it 5 years earlier, a decision born not out of fear, but clarity. Back then, Grant had begun to treat my contributions like footnotes. I felt the shift before he ever acknowledged it. The reduced responsibilities, the quiet corrections, the way he increasingly relied on Lydia's opinions, even before she returned to the company. I saw the pattern long before it became undeniable, and I understood one truth. No one protects your life's work better than you do. My name, Tessa Morren, sat discreetly on a frosted glass door at the end of a quiet hallway in a renovated warehouse building. Grant believed I spent my occasional Fridays doing yoga or volunteering. The truth was that I spent those mornings here shaping something of my own, not revenge, not escape, just sovereignty. When I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the familiar smell of paper, ink, and cedar wood greeted me. My office was simple. Wooden shelves, soft lighting, plants lining the window, and a large table covered with binders labeled with dates and system versions. Everything was organized. Everything had intention. I set my bag down, exhaled, and the weight of the morning lifted slightly. This was the place where I stored every operational document I ever created, every contract draft, every procedural map, every workflow diagram, every revision to the system architecture. Everything Morren Dynamics relied on, 70% of their daily operations, originated here in this quiet room. It wasn't a secret. It was record-keeping. It was protection. The silver USB rested in my palm again. I turned it over slowly, tracing the engraved initials, TM, the same initials that now named my consulting firm. Grant thought TM still stood for Morren. He had forgotten something essential, Toi Lun Yo, Con Onge Lun Quen. I always remember, while he always forgets. Inside the USB was the core framework of the operational system I built years before the company incorporated. The blueprint, the skeleton, the design that transformed a living room project into a scaled enterprise with multi-million-dollar contracts. When Grant asked me to transfer ownership documents to his name years ago, I signed, but not without adding an embedded clause crafted with a lawyer I trusted. A quiet founder protection clause, a clause requiring periodic reauthorization from the original creator each year, a clause that would lock the system if the authorization expired and could only be reactivated with my signature. Grant never asked what he was signing. Lydia never questioned the legalese. They both assumed I was harmless. For years, I reauthorized the system silently. One digital signature, once a year, routine, invisible. Necessary. But 3 days before the suspension incident, the renewal window had opened, and for the first time in 3 decades, I did not sign. Not to punish him, not to sabotage the company, but because he had made it clear, publicly, loudly, that I had no place there anymore. If I no longer belonged, then neither did my work, and if he refused to acknowledge my contributions in life, he would face them in consequence. I sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and connected the silver USB. The screen is filled with structured folders, system foundations, version histories, recovery protocols, legal safeguards, my entire invisible legacy. I scrolled through the files slowly, my fingers steady. Most people think silence is passive. They're wrong. Silence can be architectural. It can be strategic. It can be calm before someone finally claims their truth. As the screen glowed against the dim room, I felt no guilt, no hesitation, no triumph, only clarity. I wasn't taking anything from Grant. I wasn't breaking anything. I wasn't destroying the company. I was simply returning ownership to its rightful place, back to the person who built it, back to the woman he spent years erasing, back to the foundation he forgot he stood on. I closed the laptop, walked to the window, and watched the late afternoon sun cut through the city skyline. Cars moved like slow currents. People crossed streets with purpose. The world continued without chaos or interruption. It surprised me how peaceful everything looked. Grant believed power lived in public displays, in shouting, in performance. But real power? It lives in understanding what belongs to you and what no longer does. As the light warmed the room, I whispered something only the plants could hear. This isn't revenge. It's a restoration. The truth wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. By morning, the company would face the consequences of forgetting the woman who built its spine, not through destruction, but through absence. And Grant would finally learn the cost of believing that a person's worth ends when he stops acknowledging it. I picked up the USB again and slipped it into its wooden case. Tomorrow will come, and with it, the unraveling. Systems rarely crash with drama. They fail quietly, precisely, obedient to the lines of code that govern their behavior. And the system I built was no exception. It did not explode. It did not scream. It simply obeyed the rules written long before the world ever knew Grant Morren's name. At 12:01 a.m., while the city slept, Morren Dynamics began to lock itself down. No alarms, no warnings, just a soft internal click, like a door turning from the inside. Across the building, employees working late shifted uncomfortably when their screens froze. A few tapped their keyboards. Others restarted their monitors. One intern blamed the Wi-Fi. But then the second lock hit, and the third, and suddenly, access denied. Permissions revoked. Authorization expired. The security gates at the ground floor refused to scan badges. Project files became unreadable. Automated reports failed. Servers that had run flawlessly for 10 years refused to open even a single operational folder. Everything the company touched, every schedule, every protocol, every client file was tied to the architecture in that little silver USB now resting inside my wooden case. Inside the building, panic began to ripple. Small at first, then louder. Is the system down? I can't access the dashboard. Why is every department locked out? And then the inevitable question whispered like a cold draft. Who has the authorization key? In the conference room, the night managers huddled around frozen screens. No one knew where the fault originated. No one knew how to bypass it. No one remembered who wrote the system's foundations. They had never needed to. Everything always worked, until the night it didn't. By 12:17 a.m., someone had called tech support. By 12:24, it reported the truth. The system is requesting the founder's original authorization. They gave Grant's name. The system stayed silent. They tried Lydia's. Nothing. Finally, someone scrolled farther down and found a name most of them had never bothered to look at closely. Founder authorization. Tessa Morren. Status. Expired action required. Direct reauthorization by originating architect. The chaos begin. Phones rang. Texts flew. Emails bounced because even internal communications depended on the system's operational core. And while all of this unfolded in a building filled with sleepless employees, I was in a very different place, standing barefoot in my small apartment kitchen, pouring hot water over a tea bag, listening to the soft clink of the spoon against porcelain. The lights were dim. The city outside shimmered in 1,000 windows. It was the most peaceful I had felt in years. My phone buzzed once, then again, then again. By the time the kettle cooled, I had 12 missed calls from Grant. By the time I carried my cup to the balcony, 19. By the time I sat letting the steam brush my face, 28. None of which I answered. I curled my fingers around the warm mug and let the silence settle, heavy and comforting. For decades, I had been the one who fixed the operational fires, responded to late-night emergencies, patched the things Grant broke with impulsive decisions. I had been the buffer the company leaned on, the invisible stability. But tonight, the silence belonged to me, and I refused to give a single piece of it back. The phone buzzed again. I turned it face down on the table. Toi hunkanai, my thu tu nai te toi. I don't need to speak. Everything speaks for me. The city's glow reflected along the rim of my cup. Cars moved like slow fireflies through the streets. It was almost surreal to know that somewhere across town, an entire company was unraveling because one woman finally stopped holding it together. People think power looks like shouting or slamming doors, but real power, quiet power, looks like a phone lighting up in the dark with 28 missed calls, and a woman choosing not to touch it. At 1:06 a.m., Grant sent the first frantic text. "Tessa, something is wrong with the system. Are you awake?" Then another. "Please call me immediately." Then a third. "Why is your authorization required? I thought all of that was transferred years ago." And finally, "Where are you?" Not one message apologized. Not one message acknowledged the humiliation from earlier that day. He wasn't calling because he had remembered me. He was calling because the company had. I took a slow sip of tea, letting the warmth spread through my chest. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't a triumph. It was the truth. Finally standing without disguise. Morren Dynamics had always been built on my work. I had simply stopped hiding it. The night grew darker. The city is quieter. My phone buzzed again, but I didn't turn it over. I didn't need to. The silence was speaking for me. By the time the sun began to edge over the city, the collapse inside Morren Dynamics had spread like a silent contagion. I wasn't there to see it, yet I could imagine every detail, not because I wanted to, but because I had lived through every other crisis Grant had caused. I knew the patterns. I knew the noises. I knew the fear. But this time it wasn't mine to carry. I heard about it later from Maribel, in pieces, in whispers. But that morning, as I poured myself another cup of tea, everything inside that building was coming undone. Grant arrived at the office at 6:12 a.m., earlier than he had in years. He entered the lobby with long, confident strides, expecting the overnight glitch to be something the interns had already solved. But when he swiped his badge, the scanner blinked red. Access denied. The guards exchanged uncomfortable looks. Grant forced a laugh, pretending it was just a malfunction, but the tremor in his voice gave him away. Someone ran to manually open the side entrance for him. His footsteps thundered through the hallway as he stormed to his office, muttering under his breath. Inside, every screen was frozen. His assistant hovered helplessly by the desk. "Sir, I can't open your files. None of us can." Grant snapped, "Did it do anything last night?" "They tried everything. The system keeps refusing new permissions." Before he could react, the door burst open. The entire legal team rushed in, papers shaking in their hands, expressions pale and tight. "Grant," the lead counsel said, "we've identified the root of the lockout." Grant straightened, trying to recover his authority. "Good. Fix it." Their voices dropped. Some avoided his eyes. "We can't fix it." Grant crossed his arms. "Why not?" The head counsel swallowed hard, then spoke. "Because the system is requesting verification from the original owner." He paused, as if hoping the sentence would stop there. It didn't. "It needs authorization from Tessa Morren." Silence. One of the lawyers set a printed page on his desk, in bold letters, "Primary Founder Authorization Required Status. Expired." Owner of Key, Tessa Morren, Maribel told me everyone watched Grant turn the color of ash. She signed it over to me," he stuttered. "Years ago. Everything was transferred. Everything." The counsel shook his head. "Not the operational core. There's a protective clause. We didn't write it, but it's airtight." A different attorney added, "The system has a failsafe that locks every internal function if it's not reapproved annually by the originator." Originator. Not the CEO, not chairman, originator. Grant's voice cracked. "Why would she put that in?" No one answered. Because the truth didn't need a voice. It was already spoken. Before Grant could gather himself, the office door opened again, this time with a sharp click of heels. Lydia stepped inside, her expression already loaded with accusation, not confusion. "What did you do?" she hissed. Grant blinked. "What did I did? I didn't build this trap, she did." Lydia's eyes narrowed. "You told me she had no real control left. You told me she was outdated, irrelevant." "I thought she was," Grant snapped. "Then you're even more foolish than I believed," Lydia shot back. "You let her walk away with the most important part of the company." Grant slammed his hand on the desk. "You're the one who wanted her gone." "And you?" she countered, stepping closer. "We're too arrogant to understand the difference between removing someone and erasing them." Twist villain versus villain. Two people who had tried to diminish me were now tearing each other apart. Grant's voice rose, desperate. "We can fix this. She'll sign. She has to." Lydia crossed her arms. "After the way you humiliated her? After you suspended her in front of the entire company? Do you think she owes you a rescue?" Grant stared at her, stunned into silence. "She won't help you, Grant. Not this time." He paced the room, running his hands through his hair, muttering, "She wouldn't let the company fail. She cares too much." But Lydia shook her head. "No, you cared about the company's image. She cared about the company's structure. And you treated her like a disposable ornament." She leaned in. "You handed her a reason." One of the lawyers spoke up timidly. "Sir, thousands of contracts rely on the internal system. If we don't restore access within 48 hours, clients will activate penalty clauses. Some are substantial." Another added, "Investors are already calling." Another, "The board wants an emergency meeting." Chaos. Layers and layers of chaos, all erupting because one woman finally stepped back from the burden she had carried too long. Grant sank into his chair, staring at the paper on his desk like it might change if he glared hard enough. "Tessa wouldn't do this," he whispered. "Not to me." And though I wasn't there to say it, the truth settled around him anyway. I didn't do anything to him. I simply stopped doing everything for him. The lawyers waited, unsure what came next. Lydia stood over him like judgment, and Grant, for the first time in decades, wasn't the most powerful person in the room. He whispered one last line, barely audible. She was supposed to stay in her place. But my place was never behind him. He had simply convinced himself it was. The power he believed he owned was already shifting, and nothing, not even his panic, could stop it. Dewey Day, La Fan Taint, Đối đầu trong phòng họp, viết đúng tán trong mami 1.000 từ. Tôi đã kiểm tra kỹ, bài này chỉ cho 10 từ. Liền mạch, cao trào đối thoại, slow down ở các câu nặng, đúng outline, đúng echo line 23. Phần 8, the boardroom confrontation, 3 words, đúng yêu cầu. I didn't return to Morren dynamics because I felt obligated. I returned because the legal team begged, and because I knew the board would eventually escalate the situation if I didn't present myself. But most of all, I went because silence can only carry a message so far. Sometimes presence must finish the sentence. I walked into the building just after 3 in the afternoon. Employees parted the way without speaking. Some looked at me with curiosity, some with guilt, others with fear. Not fear of me. Fear of the truth my presence represented. The elevator doors opened onto the executive floor, where Grant, Lydia, and 4 members of the legal team were waiting in a tight cluster outside the boardroom. Their conversation halted the second they saw me. Grant looked disheveled, tie loose, hair unsettled, eyes frantic. Lydia, in contrast, stood perfectly composed, but the tightness in her jaw betrayed how much control she had already lost. "Tessa," the head counsel said, stepping forward, "thank you for coming. The board is waiting." Grant didn't wait for formalities. He stormed toward me. "You're destroying my company!" he shouted, loud enough for the entire floor to hear. "You are sabotaging everything I built." I didn't flinch. His anger washed over me like wind against stone. "I'm not destroying anything," I said softly. "I am reclaiming what is mine." Grant's face reddened, but before he could yell again, Lydia cut in sharply. "We can resolve this civilly," she insisted, gesturing toward the boardroom. "We just need your signature to reactivate the system. After that, we can reassess." Reassess, I repeated, raising an eyebrow. Is that the word we're using today? Lydia's polished composure cracked ever so slightly. We entered the boardroom. 12 members sat around the long table, tense, unsettled. Screens were frozen behind them, projecting nothing but a company logo that refused to load fully, its fractured animation a perfect metaphor for the day. I didn't sit. I let them see me standing, steady, unshaken. The lead counsel began. Mrs. Morren, the company requires your direct authorization to restore system access. Mr. Morren's credentials are not enough. Neither are Ms. Crane's. The founder clause you signed into the system requires your reapproval every year. Without it, the company functions cannot operate. Grant slammed a hand onto the table. She added that clause, without telling me. I turned to him. You never asked what you were signing. You just signed. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Lydia stepped forward, switching tactics. Her voice slid into a tone meant to soothe, manipulate, persuade. Tessa, we understand emotions are high, but this affects thousands of employees, vendors, clients. The board needs you to cooperate. Cooperate? I repeated. Where was that word when I was being erased one title at a time? The room stiffened. The board shifted uncomfortably. I placed my folder on the table, opened it, and spread out several documents. Contracts Grant had modified without my knowledge years ago. Edits that attempted to sever my influence quietly, changes that minimized my role while retaining my work. The air thickened. This, I said, tapping one contract, was the original operational ownership agreement. Then I slid forward the second document, Grant's edited version. And this is what you changed. Grant sputtered. I only streamlined it. I looked at him steadily. Streamlined me out of it, you mean? He looked away. I continued, my voice measured. You removed my name from amendments I wrote. You rephrased contributions so they sounded like yours. You eliminated the founder's acknowledgement clause, hoping no one would notice. I turned a page slowly, deliberately. Except I did. Silence draped the room like a heavy curtain. Grant tried to recover. You can still fix this. Just sign the authorization and we can discuss. No, I said. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Lydia stepped in again, her mask tightening. Tessa, you're overreacting. These clauses are outdated. The company has evolved. We can negotiate a new structure. I studied her face. Sharp, composed, but cracking under pressure. Lydia, I said evenly, you tried to erase me before you even understood what I built. You could feel the board holding their breath. Grant growled, You can't just hold the company hostage. I met his eyes fully for the first time that day. I'm not holding anything hostage. I'm reclaiming accuracy. Then, slowly, deliberately, I delivered the line that had lived inside me for years. Ong Quen, Nyung Toi Thi Kung. You forget, but I never do. The room froze. I let the words linger. Slow, weighted, unhurried. We built this company together, I continued. You took credit alone. You made decisions without me. You brought your former wife back and let her undermine everything I created. And then you humiliated me in front of an entire company for reasons that had nothing to do with business. Grant opened his mouth, but no words came. I continued, still calm. So no, Grant, I won't sign anything today. Not a single document. Not until there is a full review of every operational change you made without my consent. Not until my contributions are restored to the record. And not until this board acknowledges the origin of the system they depend on. A board member cleared his throat. Mrs. Morren, are you saying you want control of the operations division restored to you? I held his gaze. I'm saying I want the truth restored. Lydia exhaled sharply. This is unreasonable. No, I said quietly. This is overdue. Grant sank back into his chair, stunned, defeated, furious. For the first time in decades, he wasn't the loudest force in the room. And for the first time in decades, I wasn't the quietest. The boardroom remained painfully silent after my last words. A silence dense enough to press against the walls, heavy enough to reveal every truth no one had dared to acknowledge. Grant sat frozen, his hands gripping the edge of the table. Lydia tried to keep her expression cool, but even she couldn't hide the fracture forming behind her eyes. The board looked back and forth between them, then at me, waiting for what would come next. For the first time, I felt no pressure to fill that silence. I simply let it breathe. The head counsel cleared his throat cautiously. "Mrs. Morren, if you don't reauthorize the system, the company cannot function. Operations will remain locked." I nodded. "I'm aware." A murmur passed around the table. Grant leaned forward. "Then what do you want, Tessa? You win. Just say it." His voice cracked on the last words, not with remorse, with fear. I set my folder down and folded my hands on top of it, steady and deliberate. "I don't want to destroy this company," I said. "I spent 30 years building it. I'm not here to tear it down." Relief flickered across a few faces. Grant's shoulders loosened by a fraction. "But," I continued, "I will no longer allow myself to be erased from it." Lydia bristled. "No one erased you?" I turned my gaze to her, calm and unflinching. "You tried to. Quietly, strategically. You shifted my responsibilities, removed my name from reports, redirected decisions to make me appear unnecessary, and Grant allowed it." Grant shot her a bewildered look. "You what?" For the first time since I entered the room, Lydia faltered. "I merely optimized the structure. By erasing me from it," I said. "Don't soften it." The board shifted uncomfortably. Someone whispered, "Is this true?" Lydia stiffened. "It was for the company's good." A small, humorless smile touched my lips. "No, it was for your ambition." Her jaw clenched. The truth landed exactly where it needed to. I looked at Grant again. "You let it happen. Either because you wanted to believe you built this alone or because it was easier than facing the truth of how much you relied on me." He didn't deny it. The room waited as I took a breath, letting the weight of the moment settle around us. "My proposal is simple," I said. "I will restore system access. I will stabilize the operations. I will not sabotage or dismantle anything." Grant exhaled deeply, almost relieved. "Thank you. But," I added, "only if you sign a full transfer of operational authority back to me." His relief snapped in half. "What?" "It belongs to the person who built it, and the person who can maintain it." He shook his head. "You can't just take back an entire division." "It was never yours to begin with," I answered. "You borrowed my work for 30 years. Now it returns to its source." The board members exchanged glances. Some nodded subtly. They had seen enough that day to understand the imbalance. I slid a document across the table. The transfer papers I had drafted long before this day ever came. Quiet preparation, not vengeance. Clarity. Grant stared at it like it was a foreign object. "And if I say no?" "Then the company stays locked," I replied, "indefinitely." He looked around desperately, but no one came to his defense. Even the board members frowned, not at me, but at him, at arrogance, at the blind dismissal, at the collapsing facade of a man who had never believed consequences would reach him. Lydia stepped forward again, switching to her most polished, persuasive tone. "Tessa, let's be reasonable. We can create a new role for you. Executive Emeritus, perhaps. Honorary, but dignified." They still didn't understand. I shook my head. "I'm not looking for a title. I'm reclaiming responsibility." "And power," she said sharply. "No," I corrected. "Power is what you two chased. I'm asking for accuracy." The difference hung in the air, sharp as glass. She opened her mouth, but I raised a hand, not rudely, simply firmly, stopping her mid-sentence. "You tried to erase me, Lydia, and you miscalculated. Erasing someone works only when they don't remember who they are." Her composure cracked fully then. The board saw it. Grant saw it. The truth laid her bare. I gathered the documents into a neat stack. "My terms are on the table," I said softly. "Sign them, and I'll restore everything." Grant sputtered. "You're doing this to punish me." I met his eyes, not with anger, not even with bitterness, but with something colder and cleaner. "I'm doing this because you made it clear I no longer belonged in the space I built. So now I'm building a space of my own." He stared at me, stunned. Lydia looked horrified. The board waited, breath held between competing loyalties. Then I did something none of them expected. I stood, smoothly, quietly, without threat, without triumph. "If you want the company to survive," I said, gathering my things, "you know where to find me." Grant shot up from his chair. "Wait, Tessa, where are you going?" "Home," I said simply, "but we haven't finished." I looked at him one last time. "You never understood. My strength was never in fighting you. It was in choosing not to." And then I turned and walked toward the door, leaving them behind in their panic, their conflict, their unraveling. I wasn't walking away in defeat. I was stepping back just enough so they could finally feel the weight of everything I had been carrying. And as the door closed behind me, I knew the twist would divide anyone who heard the story. I didn't crush them. I didn't save them. I simply let them face themselves. Sometimes that is the sharpest justice of all. 2 days passed before the board summoned me again, not with demands this time, not with threats, but with a quiet request to return. The tone alone told me everything had shifted. People only whisper when they have finally recognized the truth they tried to deny. When I walked through the lobby of Morren Dynamics, the building felt different, not because the decor had changed, but because the people had. Conversations paused when I passed. This time, there was no mockery, no careless laughter, no whispered insults about retirement. Instead, there was something else in their eyes: recognition, maybe even respect, and from a few, guilt. The board met me in a smaller conference room, more intimate, less combative. Papers were already arranged neatly on the table: transfer documents, operational authority assignments, revised governance structure. Grant was there, shoulders slumped in a way I had never seen. He looked smaller, not physically but in presence. A man stripped of the illusion that had carried him for decades. Lydia sat to the side, her posture still poised, but her eyes tight with fear she couldn't disguise. The chair of the board began. "Mrs. Morren, thank you for returning. We've reviewed everything. The company acknowledges your foundational role, and we agree to restore operational control to you, as requested." He slid the papers toward Grant. For a long moment, Grant didn't move. His jaw flexed, his hands twitched, but he didn't touch the pen. I watched him struggle, not with the documents, but with the reality that the woman he spent years diminishing was now the one standing above the wreckage he created. Finally, with a trembling breath, he picked up the pen and signed the first page, then the second. By the fifth signature, his hand shook so badly he had to pause. He didn't look at me when he said, "I never thought it would come to this." My voice was steady. "Neither did I, but here we are." He signed the final page. The board collected the papers with visible relief. And then came the second piece of business. The chair turned toward Lydia. "Ms. Crane, the board has completed its review of your actions. The evidence shows repeated overreach, unauthorized interference in internal structures, and attempts to unilaterally alter governance without board approval." Lydia stiffened. "I acted in the company's best interest." "No," the chair said firmly. "You acted on your own." He set a separate folder in front of her. "Effective immediately, your role as strategic advisor is terminated. You are not to return to the premises without written authorization." The words landed hard. She kept her composure, but I saw the flicker, the exact moment she realized she had overplayed her hand. Grant looked at her with a mixture of betrayal and dawning clarity, but he didn't defend her. He didn't defend anyone. He was too busy trying to understand what he had allowed. Lydia gathered her bag, lifted her chin, and walked out without a word. Her heels clicked down the hallway, each step a reminder that ambition without integrity eventually collapses under its own weight. When she disappeared, the chair turned back to me. "Mrs. Morren, we hope this marks a new chapter. The company needs stability. It needs its foundation back." I nodded. "I'll restore the system, and I'll ensure operations run smoothly. But I won't stay long term. This chapter is closing for me, too. Surprise flickered across his face, but understanding followed quickly. Some doors are meant to be fixed, not lived in again. When I exited the conference room, the whispers began immediately. She really did it. I thought she'd crumble. No, she stood up in her own way. Ba dung la dung de teo ket ko ring min. Their words weren't gossip this time. They were acknowledged. As I stepped into the lobby, I saw a familiar figure running toward me. Maribel. Her eyes were bright, her breath unsteady, as if she had been waiting for this moment. "Miss Morren," she called. "I heard everything." Before I could speak, she threw her arms around me in a tight emotional hug. I froze for a second, not from discomfort, but from the unexpected tenderness. She pulled back, her voice shaking. "You showed me something important today," she said, "that it's never too late for a woman to choose herself, to change her life, to walk away from what no longer honors her." Her words struck deeper than she knew. She wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for the younger version of me, the girl who once believed that loyalty was the same as love, that sacrifice was the same as worth, that standing behind someone was the same as being seen. "Thank you," she said softly, "for showing me that strength doesn't always look loud." I placed a hand on her cheek, the way you do when you recognize someone carrying the same fire you once did. "You'll find your own path, Maribel," I told her, "and you won't let anyone take your voice away." She nodded, tears forming. When she stepped back, I took one final look at the building, the glass walls, the polished floors, the place I had poured my life into, the place that once took everything I gave but never learned to give back. The signatures were done. The truth was restored. The battle was over. But my story? It was just beginning. The evening after the signatures were inked, the world around me softened in a way I didn't expect. Not triumphant, not victorious, just quiet. A quiet that felt earned, like an exhale held for too many years. When I reached the house Grant and I once shared, the lights were on, but the place felt dim, as though even the walls understood something had broken long before the paperwork confirmed it. Grant arrived home later than usual. I heard the front door shut with a heaviness different from his usual sharp, hurried entrance. No anger, no swagger, just the slow creak of a man carrying the weight of consequences he shaped himself. He stood in the living room doorway, watching me as I carefully removed the framed photos from the shelves. Pictures of our early years, smiling, ambitious, hopeful, moments frozen long before our roles shifted into something unrecognizable. I wrapped each frame in newspaper and placed them into a box labeled simply, "Past." For a long while, he said nothing. Finally, in a voice stripped of confidence, he whispered, "Tessa, I'm sorry." I didn't turn around. I continued folding old memories with steady hands. His apology didn't land like a shock. It didn't sting. It simply floated there, too light to carry the weight it should have held years ago. "I mean it," he added quickly, desperate for acknowledgement. "I lost my way. I let people influence me. I didn't see what I was doing to you." I set down the last photo and finally faced him. The man standing in front of me wasn't the same man who had humiliated me in front of 120 employees. This version looked older, smaller, like the consequences had peeled away his armor and left only the truth. "I know you're sorry," I said softly, "but apologies don't undo patterns." He stepped closer. "We can fix this. We can rebuild." I shook my head, offering him a gentle, tired smile. Not cruel, not bitter, just final. "Grant," I said, "we've gone too far to go back." The sentence rested in the air with a soft thud. No dramatic rupture, no shouting, just reality, settling into its rightful place. I turned away and continued gathering my things, not angrily, not hurriedly. My movements were deliberate, quiet, almost ceremonial. I replaced the old curtains with lighter ones I had bought weeks earlier but never hung, sensing my departure long before this day arrived. I folded linens, emptied drawers, sorted through objects I no longer wished to carry with me into whatever came next. At the center of my dresser sat the small wooden box, the one that held the silver USB. I lifted the lid and placed the USB inside with a kind of reverence, not because of the power it held, but because of what it symbolized. The years I gave, the systems I built, the strength I rediscovered. I closed the lid with a soft click. Grant watched, eyes glassy. "So that's it? You're leaving?" "I'm choosing myself," I corrected. Something I should have done a long time ago. He sank onto the couch, the breath leaving him in a defeated rush. "I never thought you'd walk away." For a moment, I looked at him. This man I had once loved fiercely. I didn't feel hatred. I didn't feel pity. Just a strange, peaceful distance. The kind that comes when you finally stop trying to mend something that was never meant to survive unchanged. "I'm not leaving out of anger," I said. "I'm leaving because staying would require me to shrink again." He lowered his gaze. "And you're done shrinking." "Yes." I carried my boxes to the car, the evening wrapping around me like a soft shawl. The air smelled faintly of river water drifting from downtown, a scent I had always loved. I took one last look at the house, not the life, just the structure. A place where I had grown, endured, and finally outgrown. My new apartment sat on the 11th floor of a building overlooking the river, small, quiet, bright. The landlord had left the keys in a simple envelope. When I stepped inside, the first thing I noticed was the light pouring through the balcony doors. Open, warm, undemanding. I set the wooden USB box on the kitchen counter and breathed in deeply. No tension, no expectation, only space. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt like a possibility. I opened the balcony door and stepped outside. The river glimmered under the streetlights, moving slowly, steadily, like a reminder that life doesn't need permission to keep flowing. And maybe neither did I. No dramatic ending, no final fight, just release, soft and quiet, the way real healing begins. Moving into my new riverside apartment marked the end of one chapter, but what surprised me most was how naturally the next chapter began. Not with fanfare, not with grand declarations, but with small choices, each one a quiet yes to myself. The morning after I left the old house, I woke to soft light filtering through sheer curtains I had chosen myself. No corporate emails, no Grant's voice echoing down the hallway, no obligations waiting on the other side of fear. Just the river, steady and silver, gliding past my balcony. I made tea, opened the wooden box, and looked at the silver USB, not with resentment this time, but with gratitude. That little object had carried 30 years of my work, my intelligence, my unspoken strength. It no longer represented what Grant took from me. It represented what I had reclaimed. That afternoon, I reopened TM Consulting, not as a backup plan, not as a secret sanctuary, but as the beating heart of my new life. I updated the website, polished the service offerings, and sent messages to a few contacts who had always respected my operational mind more than my title. By the end of the week, 3 contracts arrived. By the end of the month, 9. By the second month, I was turning offers away. People weren't coming to me because I stood behind a CEO. They were coming because I was me. A few weeks later, as I was reviewing proposals in the office, I heard a soft knock on the door. When I looked up, Maribel stood there, neat blouse, hopeful eyes, clutching her small bag like a lifeline. "Ms. Morren," she said gently, "I left Morren Dynamics." I blinked, surprised. "Why?" "Because I didn't want to become the kind of woman they would have molded me into," she said. "I want to learn from someone who builds without crushing others." Her words hit deeper than she knew. "Are you asking?" I began. She stepped forward, voice steady. "I'd like to work with you, if you'll have me, even if it's just part-time, even if I start at the very bottom." I smiled, wide, real, unforced. "You won't start at the bottom. You'll start beside me." Her eyes softened with relief. She became my assistant, then my collaborator, then something more precious, a reminder of the woman I had once been and the woman I was becoming. Watching her grow, I realized healing isn't only reclaiming what was lost, it's handing forward what you learned. Weeks turned into months. My days filled with structure, I shaped myself. Morning tea on the balcony, gentle walks by the river, late afternoons spent guiding clients, and evenings where I cooked small meals in my quiet kitchen without the pressure of performing for anyone. Freedom has a sound. For me, it was the low hum of a dishwasher, the turning of a page, the clink of a spoon in a ceramic mug. Small, ordinary sounds that suddenly mattered. Then, one cool Thursday morning, as I was reorganizing some financial projections, my office door opened again. This time, a familiar voice came before I even looked up. Tessa Morren, still building empires quietly, I see. I turned. Graham Caldwell, 62, former financial advisor at Morren Dynamics, stood in the doorway with a warm smile. We had worked together for years, always cordially, always respectfully. He had left the company long before the chaos, choosing early retirement over corporate politics. "Graham," I said, genuinely pleased, "I didn't expect to see you here." He stepped inside, carrying a folder tucked under his arm. "I've been following what you've built with TM Consulting." His eyes sparkled with admiration, untainted by ego. "It's impressive, Tessa. Really impressive." I laughed softly. "It's small." "No," he corrected gently. "It's yours. That makes it bigger than anything you built for Grant." He placed the folder on my desk. "I'd like to collaborate. A partnership proposal. I handle financial structure. You handle operations. We choose clients that value integrity." I studied him, the calmness in his voice, the sincerity in his eyes, a man who didn't need to overshadow to feel significant, a man who didn't fear strong women, a man who understood the difference between ambition and greed. Everything Grant wasn't. "A partnership?" I asked teasingly. "Are you sure you want to work with a woman who caused a corporate mutiny?" He laughed, the kind of laugh that warmed the room. "Tessa, I want to work with a woman who saved herself." I didn't answer immediately. I let the moment breathe, savoring the contrast. Grant had always needed the world to orbit him. Graham respected that I had built my own orbit and simply asked if there was room for collaboration, a reflective foil, the universe's way of saying, good men exist too. Finally, I extended my hand. "Let's explore it." He shook it with both of his, steady and warm. When he left, I sat quietly in my chair, feeling the gentle hum of possibility. Not romance, not yet, maybe not ever, but respect, partnership, humanity. Life after 60 wasn't an ending. It was a spacious beginning, and for the first time in decades, I wasn't standing behind anyone. I was standing exactly where I belonged, in the center of a life I chose. The first thing I grew to love about my new apartment was the balcony. It was small, barely large enough for a chair and a narrow table, but it overlooked the river in a way that made the water feel like part of my own breath. Every evening, after finishing work with clients or reviewing proposals with Maribel, I would stand outside and let the air settle the day inside me. It became a ritual, a kind of soft ceremony of beginning again. On the night everything finally came full circle, the sky held the faint glow of the late hour, and the river shimmered, like a long ribbon stretching toward some peacefulness. I stood barefoot on the balcony, my hands resting on the railing, watching the lights quiver across the water. For the first time in many years, my mind was quiet. Not empty, not restless, just quiet in that rare, profound way that only comes after a long, hard reclaiming. Behind me, inside the apartment, sat the small wooden box I kept on my desk. It had followed me through the most critical turning points of my life. Tonight, I knew it was time to open it one last time. I walked inside, each step steady, and set the box gently on the table. My fingers lingered on the lid before lifting it. Inside, cushioned by a folded cloth, was the silver USB, the object that once held the backbone of an entire company, the object that had locked a corporate empire at 12:01 a.m., the object that carried years of uncredited labor, unseen intelligence, and quiet endurance. I lifted it with both hands, letting the metal rest across my palms. The engraving had softened over the years, but the initials were still visible, still carrying the weight of the past. As I held it, memories rose like quiet waves. The sleepless nights building systems on a computer balanced on a wobbly table. The years of standing behind Grant while he took the spotlight. The humiliation of his voice echoing across the auditorium. The calm I found in the cafe as 28 calls lit up my phone. The moment in the boardroom when I looked at the man I once loved and finally chose myself. I always remember, not to hold a grudge, but to honor the woman I had been and the woman I had become. I took a deep breath and walked back to the balcony with the USB still in my hand. The wind moved gently around me, brushing my hair across my cheek. Down below, the river flowed without hurry, steady and patient. A quiet reminder that healing has its own rhythm. For a fleeting moment, I imagined throwing the USB into the water, watching it vanish beneath the surface, letting it sink into darkness, never to be touched again. But as quickly as the thought came, it faded because destruction was never my way. My power had never lived in breaking things. It lived in deciding where they belonged. So instead, I stepped back inside, walked to my desk, and opened the top drawer. Pens, notebooks, fresh contracts, business cards from new partners, even a sketch of a new service model Maribel and I had been shaping. Tools of a life built by choice, not obligation. I placed the silver USB inside the drawer. It felt right. Not dramatic, not triumphant, just right. The click of the drawer closing was soft, almost like the exhale of a door finally allowed to rest. I stood still for a moment, absorbing the weight of that quiet act. It was not an ending. It was a placement, a reordering of my life. The past returned to its proper place so the present could breathe freely. As I lifted my gaze, I caught my reflection in the glass of the balcony door. A woman with silver strands in her hair and steadiness in her posture. A woman who had once lived as a shadow behind a powerful man and now stood alone in her own light. A woman who had rebuilt herself piece by piece. I used to be a shadow, I whispered to the reflection. Now I am myself. The words settled warmly inside my chest, anchoring themselves like truth always does. I returned to the balcony, letting the night air wrap around me. Then, with a soft, steady voice, I spoke as if to whoever might be listening beyond the railing, beyond the river, beyond the screen this story would eventually reach. If you have ever felt overlooked or made small, if you have ever been treated like a footnote in your own life, please remember this. You have the right to stand up. You have the right to walk away. You have the right to start again at any age. The river shimmered, almost in response. I will always remember, I added quietly. Toi luanyo. Not out of bitterness, out of clarity, out of growth, out of love for the woman I finally chose to become. Then I turned toward the invisible audience that had stayed with my story from humiliation to healing, from silence to autonomy. What do you think? I asked softly. Do you believe I was wrong to walk away when I did? Do you think I should have forgiven sooner or fought harder? Tell me what you would have done. Share your thoughts so we can think together, reflect together, and heal together. I took one final slow breath, feeling the night settle around me. I am Tessa Morren, I whispered, and this is the beginning of who I truly am. And the river kept flowing.